Welcome to Lectionary Call-In for Tuesday, March 30th of 2021, where two laypersons, a pastor, and an academician gather for about 55 minutes each week to discuss the Gospel Lectionary for the coming Sunday. And this Sunday is April 4th. That's Easter Sunday. Each Tuesday we call in from wherever we may be at 6:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And for our friend Charles Willard in Minnesota, that's 5:30 a.m. Our little team is working to be faithful to Lectionary Year B, and we hope this discussion will provide areas of focus and reflection. Here's how it works. We develop perspectives independently after the leadoff person shares some questions, and then in this virtual discussion room, we share, encourage, and challenge each other. And here are the folks joining us in today's discussion.
Bill Hall.
Sarah Mickelson.
Charles Willard.
And I'm Don Upton. And Bill is our leadoff for this week. Hello, Bill. What's up?
Good morning, team members, and to those tuning in later, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We're glad you're a part of this conversation. As we are well aware, we're approaching Easter Sunday while living through Holy Week this year. So this focus is on the resurrection, and we will be reading Mark's account of that from Mark 16, verses 1 through 8 from the New Revised Standard Version. This is the word of the Lord. Let us listen. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, by way of background, and then we'll get to the questions I have sent my colleagues, and they may well have other questions to bring to this text. I have tended over the years to read all of the potential endings to the Gospel of Mark. I'm not going to get into them, but if you open any translation, you will see that I don't know of one where it ends where I just finished reading. There are other endings, and that's too many weeds to get into as to what they are and the theories about which ones may or may not be authentic. What I rediscovered this week in preparing for this is there tends to be scholarly agreement across the spectrum theologically that what I just read was in fact the original final ending to Mark. There are other sections that are added as I noted. So it occurred to me, I've never really let myself live with that possibility. That Mark, which was by all accounts the first gospel to be written and distributed, the others followed after that, ends, we might characterize it various ways, rather abruptly, and in some ways disturbingly, and we'll get into that. So I invited myself and my colleagues to go with that. Let's believe that this is how it actually ended, and then ask ourselves what meaning that may have had then and what it may have now. We remind ourselves frequently, appropriately, that we cannot really get into the mind of Mark or whoever composed it. But we can get into our minds and hearts today. What does this say to me? And it had to really focus on, this is how the first written gospel ended, stirred a lot of me. We'll see how this goes. Now, the first question that I offered, and Sarah, I didn't give you a heads up. I'm going to come to you first here in a moment. Understanding that Mark was the first gospel written, how do you imagine, and again, assuming that this is the ending, how do you imagine that his shorter version impacted the early readers, and how does it influence or impact you, Sarah?
Well, when I read this question, I spent some time thinking about the construct, the writing construct that Mark used, and the reasons to include certain things and the reasons other Gospels have additional information. And so I wondered about what Mark chose to include, chose to reference, chose to define for his reader. And I'm hungry to hear more about the why he elected to include and to conclude the Gospel this way. I want to be clear that I'm not confused about why he wrote the Gospel. I'm more interested or fuzzy on the selections of text and on the election to focus upon certain aspects. And I would love to hear from him about the ending. Oftentimes there's a postscript in books that I have thoroughly enjoyed. And the postscript usually tells you kind of what happened to those characters after the narrative is done. And I wonder, in those cases, I'm not ready to put the book down. And so I continue to be hungry to hear more about the story or the people or the situation, or to understand how, what happened to the Von Trapps after they crossed the mountain, those kinds of questions. And so I'm thinking about in the Gospel of Mark, and how does the ending here influence me? And what I came to understand is I cannot stop here with the book of Mark, because I'm a child of the resurrection, and I have other narratives, and I have, or I should say I have other synoptic Gospels, and I have, John's Gospel. And so I have additional information to turn to. And my brain goes, but there's more to the story, because we already know there's more to the story. So it's almost like I've seen that the dawn breaks and then the day is opened and goes on. So it's difficult for me to shake the idea that this is where the story that Mark is going to tell will end. Because we already know the road to Emmaus. We already know that that Mary Magdalene finally goes and tells them, and they don't believe her. We know so much more is going to unfold, that for me to stop here and go, okay, well, that's fine. Mark's done telling a story. Let's flip over to Luke, or let's flip over to Matthew. Let's go to look at John. And so I tend to, I'm sure this is what Charles was going to say, I tend to look at the story from four perspectives and not just through the eyes and lens of Mark. And my brain sees it as one panoramic look at the life of Christ, instead of as one person's writing and a second person's writing and a third person's writing. I tend to look at the story from a triangulated perspective instead of, I don't think the word's triangulated when it's four, but I tend to look at it in aggregate instead of the selection and the gospel from one perspective. So I have a difficult time imagining how this impacted the early readers. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. Don.
Early readers and all who have ears, which is a part of this. I think, from what I understand of Mark, there's a lot to gather up, even at that point. We're dealing with, and I'm looking at the scholars on this, 40 years after Jesus, thereabouts, maybe. There's a lot to gather in at that point, and maybe other writings, clearly some other writings and fragments, other stories. A lot of people have been touched. So there's a lot of gathering in, which makes this really interesting to me too, just because it's not really one source. There's a lot going on. The second thing is that there's a tradition here that there is an authority speaking here. There's someone. It's almost like the living memory speaking out to someone who's recording it. And I think there's a general belief that we're tied to the 40-year point, that there's a living memory speaking here, and that matters to me. And I think that really mattered to the listener and the reader of the time. Think about, am I getting that right for our seminarians? 40 years, is that a fair number to use after Jesus? 40 or 50?
I think that's right. I believe it's understood that Mark wrote this after the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Again, that's not my strong suit, Don, and Charles, jump in.
50. And the reason I'm saying that is, even though I think we view time differently, I don't believe time is time is time. I believe human beings have a different clock depending on your time and your culture and how you feel. And so I'm not saying time is felt the same way that we do today, but just for fun, 40 years ago would be Ronald Reagan being inaugurated. It's back there, but it's not all the way back. And so there's this gathering in of all this information relative to, for us it would be 1981. Now I know lifespans were shorter and all these other things, but I think it's kind of on the cusp of the loss of living memory. That matters to me, and it was built to be portable. And the image I have are, the classic Christian image of boats. Yes, it traveled over land. Yes, there was an oral tradition, but I'm thinking about the early ministries, the missions, what was going on in Rome. What's written down is going to move around by boats for centuries to come. The word is going to go on boats, and I like that too. Also, it matters if you go to the trouble to put something in writing at the time. It really matters for some reason, not just to be portable, but it matters. Not that it doesn't matter today, but it's a lot easier to put things on print and print them and hand them or send them electronically. This really, really matters. And then the end, which is just one of the beloved endings in all of Scripture. I agree with you, Sarah, about being a child of the resurrection, but I'm also intrigued that we just can't handle this ending, that this cliffhanger is not okay. And I think it's just the desire to meddle with it, to say, well, I don't know that my fellow human beings are going to like this very much. Here's a little more for you. I think that temptation is really interesting, and I think this is a beloved ending. I love this ending. That's what I've got.
Thank you, Don. Charles, your thoughts on this question? You're muted.
You're muted.
Maybe I should just stay unmuted, but my mouth closed. I think we have a hard time knowing what to do with this. Most of us, I don't think, because most of us grew up with the Gospels as something that we read when we went to Sunday school and something we read when we went to church and something we heard about. But I can't remember to the extent I can remember anything that happened when I was 12 years old. I can remember some things, but not very many things. And I don't remember ever scratching my head saying, well, why in the world did Mark stop there? That never happened. And there was a good reason why it never happened, and that was because there was never any puzzle about what happened next. So I think trying to figure out what Mark was trying to do, etc., I'm not sure it's a good use of time, except to start with where we are, which is that this is what we have, and assume that's the way the writer of Mark intended it, and then to ask, okay, what could it have meant? What could have been what could have been the motive behind doing it that way? And remember, he didn't have the other three Gospels to look at to see how somebody else had done it and say, no, I'm going to do it differently. So far as we know, Mark was sui generis. If there were other Gospels like that around, we don't have them. Mark is the first one we have, and so it's nothing that he was playing off of. There was nothing he was changing. This is just the way he did it, and so I think it does make sense not to know that we can actually know what Mark was doing, but to ask ourselves, okay, what might have happened? What would have been the rationale? Because the people reading it, they also knew that it didn't end there. They knew that although the report is here that women were frightened, scared out of their wits, to use it's a slightly different, but it's a much stronger statement that Sarah Rudin puts in her new translation of the Gospels. They beat it out of there, but we know, at least there's large witness that they got back to the disciples and they passed on the word. So then the question is, what might we have been prompted to think? And I like the argument that's been proposed by some scholars that Mark is intending to, push us back to the beginning. So it starts all over again, except that now you go through the book knowing what happens at the end. You already know the ending when you get back the second time around, and you keep making that trip, reminding yourself of what the ending actually is, that Jesus is raised, and this is not like Lazarus, where he came out with all of his clothes and still on, his burial clothing. In this case, Jesus comes out as a resurrected God. Thank you.
I will add that a quick Google search points out that the most common phrase in the New Testament is "do not fear." And I think that's a curious follow-up to the way this particular gospel ends at this point. It's almost like there's an unspoken contradiction.
Yeah, and I will build on that. Sarah, I hadn't thought of your analogy of The Sound of Music, which came out when I was, isn't that the movie you referred to? Mm-hmm. Okay. It came out when I was in graduate school, and recently, rewatching it, something occurred to me. When my wife and I went to see it for the first time, we already knew that it turned out well. We'd heard from others, okay? And so I'm sitting there just enjoying the music and delighted at the ending. And actually, we had the privilege of going to the Von Trapp home and spending a week there and met Maria, whoever it was that was still alive at the time, a delightful person. When I rewatched it last year in light of all that was going on, I began to experience the drama of the threat that they were under. If my memory is correct, one of the daughter's boyfriends ends up betraying them, okay? And when I watched it last year, I'm not going to say, I don't want to be melodramatic, but instead of rushing emotionally to the happy ending, I began to sense something of the very real threat that they were under, and by extension, all the others there. So now, how does that apply to this? What has struck me this week, seeking to discipline myself to believe this was the first account, it seems to me that whatever Mark intended, the way he ends it was likely a more accurate reflection of that early reaction to this resurrection of Jesus. People are frozen. Yeah, there's good news, but the women go prepared to minister to a dead body. They are anxious about how they're going to roll the stone away. Their whole mindset is on grief and loss, and I don't think it's stretching imagination. They may have been at least thinking to themselves, if not saying, maybe we'll get there. If we can't roll the stone away, we can't even do the ministering to the dead body, which was a part of their culture, as I understand it. So, it struck me that you have that mindset, and then you discover the stone is rolled away. Here's this strange personage, just a man in white, telling you that he is risen. And it reminds me that this may or may not connect. We've noted before, Mark jumps into the story at the beginning of Mark. There's no birth narrative. There's no reference to it. He tells us nothing about that. He introduces John the Baptist. Jesus is baptized in the wilderness, and here we go, immediately. And so there's this getting into the life of Christ, and then I'll say a little more when we look at the next two questions of some other impact that I think this might have had. But again, to repeat myself, what most struck me trying to enter into reading it the way Mark apparently ended it is to let myself live with, yeah, Sarah, you're right. The message is do not be afraid. Guess what? There are things I fear. I heard that, I think she's the director of the CDC talking about her fear of this surge that's going on. Fear is real. And yes, it's nice to know that there can be a different kind of ending. But I've been more waiting to let myself experience the ending and focus more on how it is possible to be frozen. I did a memorial service this week for a very tragic situation, and hearing some of the family members, they are where those women were approaching the tomb. They're dealing with their grief and the painful loss that they've experienced, and they weren't ready to rush past that to the good news, which of course I shared in the service. So I will stop at that point and go to, I'll try to summarize. I had originally offered two other questions, but it occurred to me that they're sort of one and the same, and then one of my team members astutely pointed that out to me. There, in what we read, the man says to the women, go tell his disciples and Peter that he, Jesus, is going ahead of you to Galilee. Go and tell. And the following verse and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And that's the ending. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And I'm asking, how do you interpret that there's this command, and again, we know that they did go and tell. Other accounts tell us that the disciples did here. But again, sticking with Mark, how do you interpret that? And then in verse 15, Mark specifically designates Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome, these same three women, as being there at the crucifixion. And now they go to anoint him. And what possible message was Mark intending to communicate by presenting these women as obviously devoted to Jesus, yet, according to Mark, they fail to act on the command to go and tell others? Don, you get to go first.
If you're facilitating a class this week or running a discussion, it might be an interesting question to say, when have you not communicated, even if asked? When have you gone quiet? Under what circumstances? Doesn't mean that you're speaking for them, but it sometimes this is held up as being very strange. Why wouldn't you speak? But I don't know about you. I've evaded. I've failed to speak. I've intentionally failed to speak. And I think that discussion might raise some interesting ideas, which would include political, fear of retaliation, lack of understanding or evasion, shock. It does say they're afraid. Have you ever been in shock? It's hard to communicate if you have symptoms of being in that kind of trauma. What about this? That I'm waiting for the right time. So you're asked to speak, and here we come, human beings, once again. Oh, I will. At the right time, right place, right opportunity, and time passes. I think that's interesting. So I think it's easy for us to get our arms around this. We just talk a little bit about, have you ever failed to communicate when you were asked, or you should have? And the answer is yes, I have. Often when I try to take control over it. And it makes me think about, through other Gospels, do not hold on to me. If you're saying, I'm going to communicate on my own terms, in a way, we're controlling the message. The message is not rolling or spelling out the way it's supposed to, the way it's intended. And then the running ahead is a part of this. I'm glad you include that, because Jesus is out there. He's going to meet people along the way. So they're asked to communicate, and they do not. But there's this beautiful note that says it's almost like they have to chase him now. Not only do you not cling to him, and you can't control the message anymore, and they're quiet, and they should be talking, but he's already out there. He's ahead of them. A lot of the work in the letters that are to be written, which will follow, are about advanced teams, people trying to act like Christ in a new way. How do you keep running ahead? Sometimes Jesus used advanced teams to go into a town in advance of the team to get things ready. Jesus is already out there now. He's way out there, so they're chasing him. He's advancing. He's ahead of them. He's going to meet them. There's this sense of almost apartness now, where they're with him. Jesus, is taken hold by Peter at one point in the Gospel. He's like, no, we will not let these things happen. He goes, stand behind me, Satan. Jesus is now long gone. He's way out ahead now. And so it is unusual the women are not communicating, but at the same time, haven't you failed to communicate too? So it might be the normal human thing, even in the face of the miracles that are taking place. And then the final note I made from you combining the two questions is pointing out that these women were there and they're at the tomb, is the message for me is that the natural allocation of labor in the culture, you mentioned culture, Bill, is gone. It's just gone. So there's this other shock that's taking place. It's their job. That is the role that they're supposed to play on this morning. So this is what they're going to do. And they're going to tend to the body, which is much about a remnant or a memory. And so they have a job to do. They are not allowed to do their job, which might be a part of the shock as well. I mean, they wake up in the morning, I think it's safe to say, first thing that pops into their mind, they have business to do. And though I know that this is very special business, very sacred business, this is their job. I don't think they're going, oh, maybe we should care for the body. I believe that the culture says that that's what you will do. You will care for your teacher. And in a sense, preserve the memory of the teacher, and you'll do the right thing. That role has been taken away from him. There's no real comparison other than to make it a little bit crass, which is, well, I'll never do my job again because there's a robot doing it now. Or, there's no such thing as the profession that I once had. It's gone. What am I going to do with myself? I know that's kind of made that narrow, and it doesn't do it justice, but what's it like when you've been replaced? Your job. My job is to tend to the dead body. That is what the culture tells me to do. That is not your job any longer. Therefore, what will you do? That's what I was thinking about.
Good. Very helpful, Don. Charles, let me go to you next. Your thoughts?
Nothing right now. Thank you.
Okay. Sarah.
So in response to your part one question, I have to confess, and you may already know this about me, is I'm one who processes things slowly, and I'm methodical. So I'm thinking about the experience of Holy Week as it would have occurred in the consciousness of the people that we're seeing go to the tomb this morning or in the morning. And I'm thinking about the visceral death that they've experienced of a beloved. I'm thinking about the proximity to life-ending threat. I'm thinking of the reaction of those closest to him that they scattered. I'm thinking of the shock of the empty tomb. And I'm thinking, might have all these things prompted their inability and their inaction to follow through on the instructions immediately. That was my first thought. It's like there's a lot to think about. There's a lot to process. How do you find the people that scattered? You have to have had, where is Peter's favorite haunt? He doesn't really have a haunt in Jerusalem. Where's he been hiding? So, we have to uncover a little bit more information to kind of step into the ideas that are going through Mary's head. And I'm going to say it's Mary's head because she's the one that we're told finds them and says, hey, the Lord is risen. At least we know that through the narratives of the other synoptic gospel. So I'm thinking about that. And I'm wondering, I wrote down a disruption of human expectation. And Don, you tapped into this a bit. They are doing what they've been conditioned to do. But I also think they're doing what they perceive to be the right and best thing to do. And I know that this is one of your favorite notions, Don, that there will be no memorializing. This is where Jesus died. This is where George Washington slept. So it's this idea that there will be no memorializing the death of something because Jesus is raised from the dead. And that is the shifting or the twisting or the flipping of that human expectation. I also am quite reminded or nudged or smacked, I think is the better word, smacked, with the Holy Spirit is telling me, but he told them this was going to happen. They did not believe him, or they couldn't understand it. It was too big an idea, or they weren't paying attention. I'm not sure what, but they were told repetitively this was going to happen, and we were told repetitively this is going to happen. So I think you're right about spending time in discomfort, that we're aware of what great loss feels like. We're aware of what great threat feels like. We are aware of the disruption of or the shifting of, I thought my life would be this and it's not. We're aware of that gap and living in that frictional space. And I will tell you that I think for many of us, we avoid that frictional space. And this invites us to sit in that moment a little bit. And I think the distance between Good Friday and Resurrection morning is that frictional space where we have to confront how very flawed our memory is, our logic is, and our abilities are not that of Christ, are not that of God. So we have to really spend some energy in that space and going, how flawed are we as creation without the divine? And I think for me that's always been that moment of quiet that takes place when you blow out the candles on Maundy, Thursday, and you know you're moving toward what life would be like if there wasn't the follow-up resurrection, and how lost you would feel. So I thought about that in relationship to your questions. And the other thing is, I think that the culture and the world are predisposed to not want to hear what the women have to say, because their expectation is the other. So when they arrive, it wouldn't have mattered if they were men or women, but whoever it is that comes and speaks this truth to them, they are not ready to hear that, and they would not have believed them. So it's almost like they had to have the pause to be able to comprehend the real. And until Jesus shows up in whoever's writing it is in Mark 16, 9 through 20, in verse 14, Jesus shows up and what he calls it, upbraids them for not believing the gospel, not believing the people that would bring them good news. And it's almost like somebody yelling, I can't conceive of it. It's like, well, I'm sorry, because you can't conceive of it doesn't mean it's not real. I'm off my box now.
Thank you, Sarah. Again, I've said that I've sought to live with this week as best I can. And one thing, an impression I've had more than once, is that being disoriented is painful and frightening, and it is an opportunity to learn and grow. Now, I don't need, nor do I think it'd be helpful to give a concrete example from my life, but believe me, there have been many times I have been confounded by events in the world or in my family or my ministry or even within myself. And as I reflected on that, I have some empathy for those who apparently tried to fix Mark's account by what they added that we have in brackets in the New Revised Standard Version. I have some empathy for that because there's a part of me when I was confounded or perplexed to want to get on through that. And fortunately, either from a friend or a counselor or whoever I shared this with, in looking back, those who were most helpful, whether or not they said this explicitly, they modeled, Bill, live with it. For now, live with what's confounding you, what's confusing you. I didn't want to hear that. In fact, in some cases, if it was especially an authority figure, it was like, tell me what to do. Help me fix this right now. And, nowadays we use this phrase, the ministry of presence, and I like that. That idea that if you're grieving, it's really not helpful for me to try to get you past that. What I can do is be where you are, to stand with you in that. And I'm grateful as I look back for people who, as it were, stood with me while I lived with the whatever it was, anger, disappointment, sense of having been betrayed, all those kinds of things. And so I felt some empathy for these women. And in a sense, I said to myself, Bill, what would you have done? And I think when I'm really honest, I'd say I'd do exactly what the women did. I'd be at least momentarily frozen. Can you imagine if they had rushed off? They are perplexed. They're barely believing. And now they're supposed to be messengers and tell others something they don't really understand. I have some empathy for that. And I think you suggested this, Sarah. As when Mark ends, they have not seen Jesus. They've only heard, they've seen an empty tomb. They've heard this strange person telling them that he is risen. They have not seen him. And it reminded me, and I've alluded to this in other broadcasts, it was a couple of years ago that I listened to the prodigal son story differently and really focused on the elder brother. And to be honest with you, when I read it, I think the Lord is saying to me, Bill, you're the elder brother. The way that story ends is powerful. We're not told the ending. It ends with the father inviting the angry, resentful older brother to come into the party. Story ends. And I think, therefore, it's saying, Bill, when you're the elder brother, what are you going to do? You can stay outside, remain angry. That is a choice. Or you can choose to come in to the celebration. And in the midst of all your anger, and which was real, the younger brother had made a mess of his life. So it also reminded me of having heard Fred Craddock preach when I was in seminary. And for me, of the preachers I've heard, Fred Craddock had a particular skill at ending a sermon with, and what are you going to do? Now, I can't replicate that for you, but somehow it ended on, like, I've used this thing, you put 3 dots at the end of a sentence, meaning there's more. He had when he finished and walked away from the pulpit, where my mind was, what am I going to do with this message? How does this apply to me? And that's what I'm asking here. I don't need to say that we as a nation and as a world are as disoriented and confounded as we've ever been in my lifetime. Now, I lived through World War II, but I was a baby and don't remember it, and I'm sure that was utterly disorienting. But we are still trying to claw our way back to some new norm, and we cannot rush through that. And this time, as we know, tragically, has impacted people, both those who contracted the disease and those who've been affected by the isolation. This has been a profoundly confusing time. And yes, there is the good news of resurrection, which we will celebrate Sunday, and I look forward to that. But I'm still, in as best I can, standing with the women outside that tomb, hearing the command, and yet perplexed and, at least for the moment, simply standing there. Okay, other comments? That concludes what I had to ask us to ponder. Charles, Don, Sarah, anybody else? Otherwise, Don, I'll hand the ball off to the quarterback.
Well, thank you for those questions, Bill. And Palma Cia Presbyterian Church is at 3501 West San Jose Street, and that's at Tampa, Florida. And for more information, you can go to palmacia.org. That's PALMACEIA.org. And we like hearing from you. And we have our own email. It's lectionary call-in at palmacia.org, lectionary call-in at palmacia.org. And for the website Palma Cia, since if you're listening in the time of pandemic and you're in isolation, we commend that site to you for great music, great sermons, discussions of the same passages on lectionary, reflections, prayers. So check that out as well. And you're always welcome, and we'll see you next time.